Season 13 closes with an incredibly gripping and fantastically well-paced story in the form of the Seeds of Doom. We spend a good portion of time in the excellent location of this base in Antarctica, where members of the World Ecology Bureau find something incredibly ancient buried beneath the permafrost, bringing it up to the surface entirely unaware of the horrors it will cause. The setting of Antarctica for this story is brilliant. This completely remote place, very isolated from the rest of the world, and what with the excessive snow and wind, and with this rather small base that these people have set up, it makes for a very restricting location that is honestly rather claustrophobic at times. If you really want to know nothing about this story going in, I'd recommend switching this review off now. Only because I'll discuss very light spoilers about the characters, the setup of the story, and its location, but I'll give you a proper spoiler warning before we get into legitimate spoilers for this one, but that's only if you want to go in completely blind. Right from the first part, everything that we need to know moving into the story is set up incredibly well, and it doesn't waste any time doing so. This pod that has been found underground eventually becomes a crinoid, and it does so within this serial by devouring people.
What is a crinoid? I mean, what does it do?
I suppose you could call it a galactic weed, except it's deadlier than any weed you know.
In what way?
Well, on most planets, the animals eat the vegetation. On planets where the crinoid gets established, the vegetation eats the animals.
Oh, that's terrifying.
Yes.
And the look of this thing is quite good. I love when the pod opens up and attaches itself to one of the characters in the first part, and begins transforming him. It's honestly pretty well pulled off, and I like the look of the entire transformation as this man gets completely turned into something different. And there's nothing that he can do about that. It's honestly kind of horrifying to watch this happen before your eyes, as this man is powerless to protect himself from what was at first just a curiosity found beneath the permafrost. And the makeup and design work here is, I think, very good. It really stands out as some of the best in classic Doctor Who. There's such a wonderful amount of tension in these first couple of parts set in Antarctica, largely brought on by the setting and of course the transformation of Charles into a crinoid. Additionally, it helps that the Doctor takes this situation extremely seriously, particularly towards the beginning of this serial. He is not messing around, and he makes that very clear.
Why did it open? Why?
Well, that could be my fault. It was frozen stiff when we took it out of the ice. I was certain there was still life there. I put it under a lamp and it started to expand.
Mr. Stevenson, what you have done could result in the total destruction of all life on this planet.
Though while he is quite straight to the point for a good deal of it, he does have some moments of levity early on. I really feel like Tom Baker and Elizabeth Sladen have been my anchors for this entire season. I've unabashedly loved them throughout and feel like I fall further in love with this duo with every passing story. And the same is true for the Seeds of Doom. I adore these characters together. They're an absolute blast to follow over the serial as they get mixed up in the unfolding events of this story. There's a good balance of these characters working together and also doing things on their own throughout the story.
How do you do? Have you met Miss Smith? She's my best friend.
I love that line so much, and they're just so adorable together. The friendship of these two characters really makes me care a lot more about all of the dangerous situations they find themselves in. I really think that were this to be a different TARDIS team, I wouldn't have enjoyed the story as much, which is a huge testament to the quality of these characters and actors who are utterly fantastic in this serial. Though we spend a lot of time early on in Antarctica, we also spend even more time in London back at the house of Harrison Chase, which is a fantastic setting. I think it works really well for the main location of this one, and because of all the leaves and greenery, you get this very autumny feel at times, which I'm just very partial to. The house that they filmed at for this story actually went on sale a couple years ago for £7.5 million. And it's a shame that I don't have $9 million lying around because it's a gorgeous location. And Harrison Chase is a great villain. I think that Tony Beckley does an excellent job with this character. He's a lover of plants and the world, perhaps even a little bit too big of a fan. You get a really good sense of this character right from the first scene, which is a testament to the writing and the performance.
And what is your bureau doing about bonsai?
Bonsai, Mr. Chase?
Mutilation and torture, Mr. Dunbar. The hideous, grotesque Japanese practice of miniaturizing shrubs and trees. What is your bureau doing about that?
Well,
No answer. You are concerned about the fate of the blue whale and the natterjack toad, but the loveliest, most defenseless part of creation, the great kingdom of plant life, received no protection at all.
This character could have very easily been over the top in the hands of a different actor, or if they had just gone for a slightly different character. And I'm so happy he wasn't, because he really helped to make this story what it is. He is the reason there's so much trouble, particularly early on, because he sends two men on a mission to steal the pod that was found. He is a rich, upper-class British man that is very in love with nature and plants, and the opportunity to get his hands on this, something entirely unique and ancient, is irresistible. This story is also paced very well. It managed to really keep me consistently invested throughout its 2.5-hour runtime by continually changing things up, either in the location, the danger, introducing new elements, or just the way that the story developed. So much of this one absolutely works so well because of how tight this story feels throughout. I never really got the impression that it was wasting time, which is incredible. I think that while it may have been technically possible to lower the episode count for this serial, you really would have had to change around so much that I don't know if it would have been as good as the final product is, which is a really excellent Doctor Who story. At this point, I do have to delve more into spoilers for this one. You can skip past this section by jumping to the time as shown on screen, and if you're going to stick with me, then let's keep discussing the Seeds of Doom. So the two people that Chase sends on this mission are Healer and Scorby, who are attempting to find and extract the pod. I think that adding these two characters into the mix was a good idea because it really adds another element of uncertainty towards the beginning of this one. They're already dealing with the dangers of the Krynoid, and then you have this millionaire interfering with these two hired goons. So the addition of these two was very helpful, not only in keeping the story more interesting, by doing things like tying up the Doctor, Sarah Jane, and Stevenson, and even attempting to blow up Sarah Jane, but also by bringing the story back to the setting of England. Now that the pod has moved there, it is a completely different game. The scale of this thing has changed. They are no longer in the middle of nowhere. They are back in the city where anything could happen, and they have to work towards stopping this threat from spreading. I loved this because it really helped both in changing the setting up and also in continually progressing the story forward and escalating the level of the threat. All of a sudden, it's more difficult to control the Krynoid and stop it from spreading. Though they succeeded with the first pod, the second pod is now in the hands of a madman, and it is going to be really difficult to stop this invasive species. And throughout all of these very dangerous situations, I love seeing how the Doctor cares for Sarah Jane. Here's an example in the moment where Scorby is trying to figure out where they've hidden the second pod.
I asked you a question, Doctor. Where is the pod? Where is it? Stubborn pair, aren't they? This time I'm not joking.
It's in the freezer now.
That's perfect. It's so simple, and I love how he immediately gives up the location of the pod, which will endanger the entire world because he cares so much for Sarah Jane. It's really a brilliant moment, and it's a very Doctor thing to do. I mentioned before that because I care so much for these characters, it makes all of these dangerous scenes that much more enthralling, and I really do believe that. Even though I know that these people aren't going to die, I can't help but be fully invested in these situations. And this leads me to the excellent cliffhanger of part 3, when we see Chase attempt to use Sarah Jane as a test subject for the second Krynoid pod. It's such a great move to have there be two pods, because it allows us to get a clear picture of what this does to a person, and then have Chase attempt to do the same thing to our beloved companion. And I thought this cliffhanger to part 3 was great. Seeing the Doctor watch these events happening before his eyes is just a great way to tease the audience into the next part of the story. And the Doctor successfully stops this when he jumps from the ceiling and tackles the people that are trying to hurt Sarah. Interestingly about the Doctor, he is very brutal in this story. He does not mess around. There is a scene where he punches the man that tries to murder him and Sarah Jane in part 3, or later in that episode when he twists Scorby's neck and head in a move I thought killed him, though quite probably just because I watched too much TV. And it's interesting to see the Doctor, just as I said, not messing around at all. We as an audience and our lead characters know the danger of the Krynoid, because we've already seen it in action. So the Doctor is basically doing everything in his power to stop it from taking over the world. And that's quite interesting to watch, because what it results in is a story that has a bit more action in it, but not to a level that feels fitting with the third Doctor's era, but perhaps some elements you might expect to find there. I don't think the action felt overdone. I feel that it was reasonably present and added to the seriousness of the situation when it needed to. Now I want to talk about the characters of Keeler and Scorby, as they have pretty important roles in this story, serving largely as Chase's goons for this one. It very much feels like a familiar dynamic where you have one character who is kind of pushing the other to do something that they are not entirely comfortable with. Their role in this story is one that you have probably seen before, but it definitely works rather well. Keeler is definitely portrayed as the more sympathetic of the two, though still somebody whose actions you can and probably should be highly critical of. He seems very dismayed at all of the bad things that they are doing, yet he still does them regardless, and Scorby is portrayed as a much less sympathetic character, being an outright hired mercenary who is only here for a paycheck and never really redeems himself. I do like the use of both of these characters within the story, though neither are particularly likable. They work well enough and are played pretty well by their actors for the purpose they need to serve. And what ultimately happens is Keeler ends up being the second person who gets transformed and devoured into the Krynoid. And all the stuff with his transformation is really good, and as an audience member, you kind of come at it from a different perspective than the previous transformation because you've already seen this happen, and therefore you know what's going to take place next. And his transformation is kind of haunting because although he's not an entirely sympathetic figure, we see him pleading to be taken to a hospital and begging for help. And ultimately, nobody does help him.
What's happening? What have you done?
It's for your own good. You mustn't move.
You can't keep me here. I need medical attention. Look at me.
The rate of increase is astonishing. Remarkable, Keeler. Protein absorption from the animal, of course.
What animal?
Your own body. We shall have to give you some food soon.
Chase! Stop behaving like a maniac and get me to hospital.
Don't be ridiculous. That would ruin everything. Together, we could be on the verge of a great scientific discovery. We must observe the process carefully.
Hargreaves, don't listen to him. This is murder.
It's pretty messed up and gruesome, not to mention just great television. And what's interesting about his transformation is that it does actually go further than the previous one. Though that time they managed to stop it before it got too out of control, this time the Krynoid just continues to grow and become something so much more powerful and so much more unstoppable. And just throughout this entire story, I found the Krynoid to be a truly excellent villain. Sometimes it can be hard to have a good villain that is lacking in character, and in this case they largely succeeded because of the solid makeup and design work, the concept, and just the way the entire thing was presented. I liked the addition of the Krynoid actually being able to have an effect on other plants within a certain radius. I think that added an extra element of danger towards the end of the story and really made things significantly worse for our protagonists. And by the way, I absolutely love the idea of a plant that eats animals, in a way much like a Venus flytrap, but on a much larger and more threatening scale. It's portrayed so well and really makes this story what it is. And the Krynoid as a villain goes hand in hand with the character of Harrison Chase, who I've already mentioned I thought was great in this story. And he is, particularly towards the end, the personification of the Krynoid, and that feels very fitting for this character. I loved the scene we got towards the end where he is sitting in his garden entirely surrounded by plants, and he just appears to feel that he belongs. He's a great character as the villain and continues to have a role throughout the entire thing, and is very much a driving force in why the Krynoid actually make it to London and become as much of a threat as they do. I love the Krynoid and I loved Chase, but I think that in many ways they needed each other to work within this story, and they complemented one another so well for this. It was as though they had this symbiotic relationship, which in some ways does become true in the end. It was kind of fascinating actually. I really thought that Chase was going to get murdered by the Krynoid in the end, the plant he admired so much being the thing to devour him. It seemed to me like a natural progression of the story, as well as something that's been done before, so it felt like a likely outcome. But I love the idea that he doesn't actually get murdered. After all, he is the one who helped the Krynoid to take over the world, so it's only fair that he is spared. So yeah, I loved him and the Krynoid and found them to be great villains for the story, which benefited from the presence of the other. I also love the death of Chase within this story. We find out about his incredibly efficient composting device, which he actually uses to compost one of the unit's soldiers that we met in this story. Yeah, this one is really dark at times. Though we don't see it happen on screen or hear anything graphic, it still happened within the narrative, and Chase ends up going out in a similar way. There is a struggle between him and the Doctor when our lead has to rescue Sarah Jane, and in Chase's attempt to murder the Doctor, it results in him dying, with our lead characters being unable to prevent his death. I thought this was a pretty great way to end the character. It's quite a dark way to go out, and it is pretty fitting that he becomes compost for the very plants he cared so much about in the first place. I know this might sound messed up, but I do wish that his screams when he was dying had perhaps been a little bit more horrendous, and that they had done something to really sell that death scene. I mean, I get that this is a family show, but I just wanted the death to be a little bit more gruesome than it actually was, though of course it's never going to be anything like Fargo. Also, there was a great moment a little bit earlier in the story when Sarah Jane attempted to save the Doctor from the composting machine and accidentally almost killed him faster by flipping the wrong switch. It was a great little moment, quite similar to what we saw just a couple of stories ago when she pulled the wrong lever, though admittedly in an even more dangerous situation this time around. It probably would have worked even better had these moments not been as close together, say if this story had been in season 14 as it was originally intended, but I still really like this beat in the story. I already mentioned that I love the location of Harrison's house, but one thing I didn't want to get into in the spoiler-free zone was how it does at times serve as a similarly claustrophobic setting to that of Antarctica. It does feel different because it is presented differently, but there are some scenes that are rather creepy around the house, particularly those set at night. And I also thoroughly enjoyed when there were several characters who were trapped inside of the house and weren't able to get out because of the giant Krynoid, which got to a point where it started to destroy the very house they were hiding in.
You have till daybreak to deliver the Doctor.
Wait. Why not now?
Scorby, if I die, you die.
I'll take a chance on that.
There is no chance!
By daybreak, the Krynoid will be large enough to crush this entire cottage to rubble.
If I could get outside, there'd be some hope for all of us.
Why don't I just throw you out?
It would make no difference!
And by the way, I love the look of the giant Krynoid with what I presume are model shots, which I thought were quite well done and fit well within the story. They didn't try to overly green screen in the Krynoid scenes, though at times that was done, it was done sparingly. In the hands of a lesser director, it's quite probable that the large version of the Krynoid would not have worked as well as it did had it been shown too much, so I thought they did a really good job in terms of that aspect of the Krynoid look and its contribution to the story. One thing I thought was really nice was the fact that even though Scorby had been on opposing sides to our main characters for a great deal of this one, the threat becomes so great that they end up working together, which I thought was really good. Even though he isn't, a good guy and isn't remotely sympathetic, it makes sense that at a certain point, he'd understand that this was the bigger threat to be concerned about. And this story does involve the use of UNIT, particularly towards the end. And what's notable about this instance is that we don't see any of the UNIT regulars, and this is the first time that that has happened in this show. I don't really mind that much. Part of me thinks that it would have been nice to see the characters return, though another part of me wishes that UNIT wasn't used at all, so that this story could stand as its own thing just that little bit more. But I also understand that in universe, it makes sense for UNIT to show up in this story and to help with the threat. So I don't really have much more of a point to make. The main thing I wanted to add is that UNIT was fine. I also was a big fan of the way that Scorby ultimately died. Him getting pulled back down into this pond by the vegetation as he attempted to outrun the Krynoid was fantastic, and probably the best looking of any of the death scenes that we've gotten in this serial. It was pretty simple, but also rather effective and came across very well on screen. Overall, I found this to be a really excellent story that was incredibly well paced throughout its 6 parts, and kept me really entertained thanks to not only the excellent villains in the form of the Krynoid and Harrison Chase, but also because of our delightful leads Tom Baker and Elizabeth Sladen, who are beyond wonderful together. I found this to be a truly great story, and I'm going to give The Seeds of Doom a rating of 9.25 out of 10. And there we have it. That's the end of this hopefully not too overstuffed review. I loved revisiting this story, and this is one of the few ones that my family actually owns on DVD, so I remember watching this one a couple of times when I was younger, and I definitely enjoyed it even more when revisiting this story for the review, and I am very interested in hearing what folks have to say about this serial, so be sure to leave your thoughts down below. As always, I will be active in the comments, and I hope to see you around this upcoming Sunday for my overview and review of Doctor Who Season 13 on the whole. I have a fair bit to say about this one, but if you don't join me again, that is 100% fine, just so long as you know that I appreciate your time here today. And with all of that said, that's going to do it for now, folks. Thank you very much for watching, take care, and have a lovely week.